Welcome to Marketecture, where you can get smart fast with in-depth interviews of technology executives. I'm Ari Paparo. We're doing a special session of recordings in person the week of Advertising Week in New York. We're in a studio in Flatiron, and we're going to find out what some leading companies have been up to. So our first episode is about mobile and in-apps, and we have two guests. So we have Charles Manning, the CEO and president of Kochava, and Vasuta Agarwal, the chief business officer of InMobi. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Ari. It's a pleasure being here today.
Love being here. Thanks for the invite.
It's kind of a miracle that you haven't been on before, Charles.
I know.
I'm not an expert in app, but I see what's happening out of the market. There seems to be a lot going on. I mean, more and more apps are really like part of our lives. We can't go through our lives. Just to give a personal anecdote, I was down at the Google trial. We weren't allowed to have phones. And I realized I had no way of finding anything, transporting myself back and forth to my hotel, talking to anyone, or really anything else. Maybe, Vasuta, you could give us a little bit of perspective on how apps are changing the way people are interacting with the world.
I think, Ari, what's happened, and I think this sort of probably got, really escalated post the whole COVID times, right? Because we all had so much time at home. And I think each of us were spending more and more time on our mobile phones because, you had 4 or 5 people sitting together at home and you needed more personalized consumption, right? And what we've seen is that, there was an explosion of app consumption, which happened at that time. And that sort of continued post-COVID, right? That habit formed and then it sort of stayed. So, whether it's, retail or food or travel, right? The consumption on apps has gone up a lot. And when you think of brands, right, this has become actually a great way for them to stay connected with their consumers beyond, the traditional world of, a retail store or just a website, right? So I think in both ways, consumers spending more time and brands finding a more meaningful channel to stay connected with their consumers, we've seen a big shift.
Right. And how does that tie into like loyalty, repeat customer usage and things like that? Is it part of the strategy that if I, as a brand, get the consumer to install the app, that I'm increasing my long-term value from that consumer?
I would say it's not a given because the brand really has to, I think, invest in the app in that way to stay meaningfully connected to their consumer, because the consumer has to find value in the app, right? It cannot be transactional and one time. But yes, they are starting to play a big role in the whole, scheme of driving loyalty and retention for the brand, because it's a great way to create a hook for the consumer to keep coming back, right? It could be about a new piece of, content in a day. It could be, reward points. It could be, personalized offers for the customer. So I think in that sense, it's starting to play an important role.
Right. Maybe that slides a little bit into what you do, Charles. Like, how are marketers using the data available to them to execute that kind of strategy?
Yeah. I mean, when I think about when the company was first formed, we had this really strong conviction that apps would supersede usage between brands and their consumers over the web. And at the time, 2012, that was an unheard of concept. It was like apps were really cute. But the idea that the traffic was going to be eclipsed, app usage traffic would eclipse the web traffic between brands and their consumers was an unheard of idea. We're now obviously there. When we looked at that space, obviously gaming was friction-free between buying media and then seeing in-app purchases. And that friction-free process really, I think, paved the pipes to expansion beyond gaming to brands. So the points about loyalty engagement, things like remote ordering and seeing the utility of the app beyond just the download has been increasingly a main focus for brands. And as we have largely started to depend on the app metaphor within our CTV environment, it's very similar to having a 65-inch phone on your wall in that there's apps, and it's like the traditional linear channel concept or linear TV concept is taking the side while the app metaphor is taking the foreground, which is kind of fun to watch.
Right, exactly. And that brings me back to a question I was going to ask you, Vasuta, which is how are the brands approaching the app environment outside of gaming? I think it's amazing that, we've been doing this for 10, 15 years and still there's so much gaming advertising for gaming advertisers. What's going on with more mainstream brands?
Yeah, I think, mainstream brands are starting to, I would say, embrace the fact that, apps is not, like I think Charles also referred to, just a cute and nice to have kind of thing. I think they're starting to understand that, if the phone or, going forward CTV, it's all about apps, right? They need to find that meaningful way to stay connected to the user. And if, users are spending 5-6 hours a day on their phone, how do you sort of use that time spent on the device? So what we see is that, they're not only just investing in the apps, but also building meaningful content, we talked about loyalty programs, different kind of subscriptions, right? To get the user hooked and come and engage on the app, right? Because the one-time acquisition is one part of it, but then engaging and, retaining the user requires a lot of, effort, time, the whole thing around, how do you remarket to the user or how do you, bring the user back? So we're seeing a lot of that across verticals. Travel, for example, is, a big one. In food and in entertainment, like these three categories, we tend to see a lot of this happening now.
We're also watching a bit of an arms race in that during COVID, Uber Eats and other services stepped up and said, we're going to help facilitate delivery from the traditional stores you love. And now those traditional stores you love are saying, actually, we've got a remote ordering feature within our app. Why don't you just come here? Because I don't want all that margin to get pushed away to a partner.
Yeah, McDonald's is just a major leader in this area. Right. So this is ostensibly a podcast about advertising. So let's talk about advertising. What does the landscape look like for app discovery and install? Obviously, InMobi's in that business. But just if you step back and say, what does the portfolio of the marketer look like and what are they thinking about?
Yeah, so, I think, of course, you have, players like ourselves who are in the mainstream, the programmatic buying space, right, when it comes to app acquisition. But I think marketers are starting to, for example, alternate ways of app discovery around, like alternate app stores, for example. And I think we heard some of that in, some of the Digital Markets Act, the way, iOS has started supporting multiple app stores. So there's an element of that which is starting to, you can say, creep in. Because you do have, OEMs, for example, and carriers who are saying, we need you to also support or look at, alternate app stores. So we've seen some early, sort of green shoots in that space of alternate app stores starting to come in the radar of marketeers, especially, in the Android ecosystem. So that's an interesting one that's starting to, raise its hand. And then, of course, on the, the app acquisition and marketing side, I think still using apps for not just like push notifications was one, right, which was like used a while for remarketing. But I think remarketing is a space which we still see marketers wanting to invest in because ultimately, if you've acquired a user, right, you've already put, some money to have that user on board. How do you bring that user back, right? So that's another space which becomes harder in the new world of, privacy, but that's still an area of interest for marketers that we see.
Do they use paid media for that, for re-engagement or reactivation?
Yes, we have marketers using paid media for re-engagement.
Right. And if we think about beyond programmatic, obviously Apple now sells search ads on their app store. Meta's a huge player in the app install. Maybe, Charles, you tell us about how people think about attribution and multi-touch or whatever the current hot thing is there.
I think you've transitioned over the last 10 to 12 years with attribution largely being kind of stuck in the last click metaphor. Our approach that's been different amongst our competitive set is that all of that attribution should really be configurable to the nth degree. And the thesis behind that is if you believe anything at all about advertising, you have to believe that the first impression does more work than people are willing to give credit when you're in an last click world. And so combined with that, you also have to believe that a 250 by 50 does less work than a 7-second interstitial. And so if you're treating all all media as the same, like a black box, then you're not appropriately allocating the right credit to the right partners. So I think that, call it the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a better handling and understanding on this notion of like a configurable, attributable waterfall.
Right. Because if you don't do that, you're just going to give all the credit to the App Store search clicks, right?
You're going to do that or the affiliate nonsense that's going on that's just trying to snipe last click.
Right.
And so, good partners don't get the appropriate credit. And, when you're in the business of measurement, you really want to think about what's the best approach to do that. Now, what's happened with this kind of privacy dynamic is, on one side, for the purpose of having greater privacy protections, there's signal loss. On the other side, as everyone in this audience probably knows very, very well, there's an inability to do occluded lists for retargeting of customers I've already acquired.
Sorry, occluded? What's occluded
like removed.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's just, the removed list versus the added list, right?
Yes. So how does a marketer figure that out when you have big holes in the user landscape privacy-wise, and you have all different kinds of touch points?
So the next horizon is this notion of kind of modern or novel MMM, or always-on incrementality. And so without looking at every single impression or every single click, you're really looking at your portfolio of media allocation. You're baselining across at least 90 days, but preferably 361, 6 days. And you're doing a model-based incrementality lift that's getting recalced daily. What's great about that is it requires zero signal, but it also gives you great insight into reallocation and kind of go forward planning that could be used. And it removes the nonsense of the self-attributing networks kind of over-attributing, like search or social. But I think we're kind of in the early stages of that. There's a lot of companies who have data science teams that are greater than 5, who are eager to build their own incrementality model. Then other companies with a half a data science resource, and they're all too ready to license a technology. Our position is, let's give either one of those audiences a tool set, because the problem is partners like InMobi can't run their media at scale based on 600 different models built by 600 different advertisers, because they've got an enthusiastic data science team.
Right. I was actually going to turn it back to you. How do you think about activation of media in that environment where everyone has a different view about what actually happened?
Like I think Charles also said, it becomes tough when, we're in the world of just last click attribution, right? And I think what's been good for us is the evolution of these attribution models, because then you're valuing users, attention span, right? Differently across formats, right? A display format versus a video format. So I think our stance has been, obviously to support how the ecosystem is evolving, because, we have to be able to work with different advertisers and with, what the mobile measurement partners are doing. For example, like, when you had the whole signal loss happen on the iOS side, we were one of the first to, support the adoption of the SK ad network, because we wanted to, be able to get ahead of the curve, educate our partners, right? Advertising partners saying this is happening. This is, what we can do to support you, right? We updated our models, our bidders, everything, right? To support that, right? So our stance has been that, as the industry is evolving, especially in the world of privacy first and, signal loss, we have to stay ahead of the curve to be able to support these changes and make our partners aware. But on the other side, we continue to obviously also see that different, and Kochava was one of our first partners to work, on the SK ad network side, that there are still partners who are, supporting, different types of attribution, probabilistic attribution models. We talked about the evolution of MMM, incrementality tests. So it's a learning for us as well, right? To be able to support different partners while keeping our advertisers at the core of it.
I want to talk about SK Ad Network for a bit because, Marketecture partner Eric Seufert is really an expert in this sort of stuff. He's sort of been talking about how it's dead. SK Ad Network is dead. It's the past. It was a failure, and now everyone's probabilistic. I think that I'm really overgeneralizing what his point of view is. Are you seeing that, or are you seeing a lot of advertisers still think it's a really important part of the mix?
It was, I think, the way SK ad network started, and with, I think 4.0 last year, it's complex, right? It's been complex for advertisers to understand, implement, stay on top of. And I think that's where that sentiment may be stemming from. But I think with the most recent change announcement that happened with the ad attribution kit, so now SK ad networks, sort of jumped to ad attribution kit. I think a lot of the changes are for the positive when it comes to, advertisers, some of the asks that people have had for a while. So I wouldn't say it's dead yet. I do think there is, a lot coming on the horizon with that. And some of the changes are positive and, bode towards it becoming and staying a strong part of the ecosystem.
Right. Charles, you see the same or something a little bit different?
Yeah, I certainly can't argue a counter argument to everything that's been said. I would agree. I think the only thing I would add is it's not really in Apple's best interest to curate and to steward the future of signalless attribution. They just need something that kind of works.
Right. Which is more than Google has.
Which is what they've accomplished with SKAd Network.
Something that kind of works. That's Apple's motto, right?
Well, and I don't mean that like they don't care about excellence, because they absolutely do. It's just this isn't an area they're focusing on to decide they're going to be the best capability. Their position is, if we're going to take a hard line on signal, then we have to have some backdoor on how measurement can happen in a signalless world. I suspect, and I think this is similar to Eric's perspective, the real thinking and logic behind measurement ends up leapfrogging SKAd Network into incrementality models. And then it's a question of, instead of it being probabilistic, how do you have incrementality-driven reallocation and optimization mechanisms? So that you got to give the partners like InMobi the signal to what they should do better and where they should dig deeper for that vein of gold. And obviously SKAd Network, Ad Attribution Kit, those are both mechanisms, but there's a few others. And so the future is not finalized.
All right, speaking of the future, so Vasuta, you mentioned third-party app stores. There's a lot of antitrust activity and regulatory activity going on. We usually talk about on this pod, the Google antitrust ad tech stuff. But in the search case, it was floated as an idea that they might be asked to spin out Android. And in other jurisdictions, there's talks of, requiring alternative app stores. I guess the big question is this good for advertising and for independent companies like your own, or is it TBD?
I think all of this, I would say, is good for advertising in general, because I think the basis of all of this is the fact that, questioning how it's impacted consumers or even, advertisers, the whole value chain, basically, right? Is it creating, a higher pricing? Is it leading, ending up consumers having to bear the cost of that pricing? So I think it's healthy and good, the way some of this will pan out, especially, for independent partners. And we'll really know what some of the outcomes of these are in the next few months. So I would say that's still a TBD, the extent of the impact. But I think given, some of this has been around for, the last decade plus, it's really sort of probing into, the core supply chain of the whole digital advertising ecosystem. So it definitely pushes for transparency and, fairness, which I think is always good.
Yeah. Yeah, we're recording this on October 6th, and I believe on October 8th, there's going to be a filing where we're going to find out what the government actually wants in the search case. All right, so this is a special episode of Marketecture, but we have to ask our trademark question. We ask at the end of every interview. I know you two listen every week, so you must know. So first, Vasuta, if InMobi was an animal, what animal would it be?
I don't know if it qualifies as an animal, but, I would say maybe a butterfly, because of, a butterfly evolves over its lifetime. And I think that's been our journey for the last 17 years. We've evolved with, from an SMS-based search engine to a mobile ad network to now a programmatic buying platform, and now, moving towards having, consumer products. So it's definitely a story of evolution and adaptation.
Interesting. I just read that even though its brain is entirely replaced in its metamorphosis, the butterfly still has memories from when it was a caterpillar. And no one's really
did not know that.
I didn't know that.
All right, Charles, your turn. Kochava was an animal. What animal would it be?
Well, there's a lot of history. Our branding has always been uniquely aggressive. Red and black. We had Cyrillic font in the early days. People wondered if we were from Russia.
Okay.
And part of the thesis behind that was, we're a bootstrap business. We don't have a disproportionate allocation for our marketing, and so our brand has to stand out. And we've really focused on having that brand be memorable. And obviously, we've toned down the brand from a Cyrillic font days, but I think it's very similar, or the way we've kind of always contemplated the company internally is one of a lion, and not a huge pack It's a very small group. We're small but mighty, and a lot of listening and a lot of watching before action.
Well, I can't say you're the first person to go with lion, but it was the most Baroque explanation. So I appreciate that. All right. Well, this was a great conversation. I learned a lot. Vasuta Agarwal, the Chief Business Officer of InMobi, and Charles Manning, the CEO of Kochava. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ari.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture Podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.